Hey everyone, this is Tommy from the Ravens Creek Study, and we're continuing in Biblical Theology 1. We looked at the last video on what the purpose of Messiah is, kind of giving that overview of how through Messiah God created all things. Through Messiah there is redemption, and through Messiah God will, again at the end of the age, bring forth the eternal salvation and the new heaven, new earth, the millennial kingdom, all these things, with a discussion on the Messiah. The question that will always rise in the minds of people is about redemption. Uh, we're redeemed, and I don't know that we all understand what redemption means or entails, but the big thing that people really want to know about is sin and our redemption from sin. Uh, this would imply something that's called the fall. In Genesis 3, when we have Adam and Eve taking of the fruit that they were told not to eat, there is a fall from grace, if you will. There's a fall from what God had intended, what God had established the creation to be and to order and function as. There's been no greater tragedy than the fall. And I think that our perception of sin and depravity fail us. Oftentimes it's too humanistic, meaning the humanity is the focus. I think that our perception oftentimes it does revolve around personal sin, if not a sin of a country or nation, or even that humanity, that we all are sinners, we are all fallen beings. But what I want to point out is that the fall stretches out beyond just humanity itself. Even the creation is moaning and groaning, waiting for the revealing of the sons of God. There's a sense in which the fall itself is something that has affected all of creation. And if we lose that perception, then we also lose the very gospel itself, because it is the eternal purpose of God to bring all of these things back together again. The question, which is the gospel, is how God will accomplish such a feat. How is he going to do it? We call it the fall, but what exactly have we fallen from? And this is where I think we've fallen from that divine order that in the beginning God created. And he said, let there be light, and there was light. He separated the light from the darkness. He established the sun and the moon and the stars as these rulers over the darkness. And there's this sense in which it almost seems like as rulers, they're supposed to keep the darkness at bay. They're not supposed to allow it to seep in further than what God has already ordained from the very beginning. And so there's this sense in which, whether we're talking about a spiritualizing of the text or whether we're talking about something literal, we can see here that God has established an order between even darkness and light. And of course, all of the creation, it just goes on from there. That's day 1, and then day 4 with the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. This is from the very beginning. All of these things have been jarred. They've been brought out of sync, and we're now in a realm of chaos. And we best understand chaos through stress, trauma, rigidity, through these moments. It doesn't have to be something that's loud and booming and causing for us to go berserk because of whatever kind of terror is all around. Sometimes it's just through the matters of when we're quietly having to endure some sort of suffering or some sort of need that the Lord alone knows that we have. Some of these things are the ways in which we can best understand chaos. There can still be a stillness, and yet there's chaos. Just like at the beginning, there was stillness, and yet the earth was without form and void and empty. Sin's a excuse me. Sin is a condition, and death is a moment-by-moment choice. Sin's not something. It is an action, but it's more than an action. It's not like just because you've committed sins, now you're a sinner. There's a condition which we have. There's a fallen state, a fallen nature. And this is something that depravity tries to speak on. And like I said from the beginning, I think that we have an inadequate view of this. But to understand that you are either in sin or in Christ, and there's kind of this either-or statement of the words of Paul, since this is usually what people go for when trying to talk about depravity, are Paul's words. To realize that there are these, I don't want to call them positions, but they're kind of positions. You're either in sin or you're in Christ. Those who are in Christ are no longer in sin. They're no longer sinners. They're no longer under the power of sin, under the power of the law, under death. And so they're able to say, Where, O death, is your sting? And he continues from that the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But Christ has set us free from both of these. The effect of both sin and death, it's to strain out life. It's to cause for us to deteriorate. And even the whole creation has this, that even in science, if you know the second law of thermodynamics, it's entropy. It's this idea that all of the usable energy, it is being deteriorated, it's being used. And so our universe is winding down. The effects of entropy would be things like your car rusting when it sits out underneath the sun for too long. All things kind of wind down. They start to deteriorate. They start to, I guess we'll leave it at they start to deteriorate and corrode and everything else. The whole of the creation is experiencing the effects of the fall, of death and of sin. And not only do we need a Messiah as humans, we need a Messiah as the creation, to bring it all back together again, to the restoration of all things. This is the very wording that Peter uses in Acts chapter 3, that Jesus is contained in the heavens until the restoration of all things that the prophets have spoken of. Jesus' death upon the cross has more power in it than to save us from hell. This is something that I feel like, I don't know how much my perception is 100% correct, but I feel like across the board there's this idea that Jesus died for you so that you could go to heaven. There's not this conception that we've been freed from sin. We've been freed from the effects of the fall, and we're being brought back again into the fullness that God had intended and created us to be in. I don't think that that's a perception that is proclaimed very often. Before the law was given, sin was in the world. We find that in Romans 5:13. The law was given on Sinai, but before Sinai, there was still sin. Ephesians 1 speaks of bringing all things together under one head, that's Christ, and the all things, that still includes the creation. For this reason, all of creation moans and groans for the revealing of the sons of God. Now, in Romans 5:13, we know that the context is specifically to humanity. But I just want to ask the question, is it possible that sin was in the world, the creation itself, the cosmos, that the effects of it, that the fall, that all these things that we're normally considering as human things, is it possible that we can extend that outward beyond just humanity, and we can look at the creation around us, whether the animal kingdom or like I said, the very earth and the stars and everything else, light and dark? Can we see how the effects of sin have even corrupted that? I believe that the whole system and hierarchy that God has made and intended from the very beginning, it's been upset. Eden has been lost, and Eden means delight. It's the Hebrew word that means delight. That God took the man and put him in delight, in Eden. And I believe that has been upset. It's been lost. Understanding that the fall affects everything helps us to understand the breadth of sin, and it also helps us to understand the redemption. That it's not simply about being free from the world so that we can go to heaven. It's not a matter of, well, now we're saved and so we can be assured that one day we'll be free from sin. The idea is that God is putting all of it back together again. There is a plan. That God has not forsaken us. God has not left us to our own devices. God has established one specific place, the garden, in which he will be in perfect fellowship with mankind, and he will rule from that one place. Now, whether we call the garden the same as Zion, we see in the Old Testament that God puts his name upon one place, and it's Jerusalem or Zion, and that's where he establishes the tabernacle and temple, and that's from where the Davidic kingdom rules, and the prophets prophesy that there will come a Messiah who will rule on the throne of David out of Jerusalem, out of Zion. I don't want to try to say that the garden is the exact same location. It might be, who knows, but still we have the same statement that what God was doing in the garden, in the description of the garden, we find the same description at Sinai, at the tabernacle, at the temple, at Jerusalem. We find the same kind of description, the same wording that we find. It goes all the way through to the very end, so that we can understand that what God is expecting and doing and the kingdom underneath David in Jerusalem, and what he prophesies will happen even after David with the coming of Messiah. That is still a restoration unto the garden. Even though it's a progression forward in the story and it's beyond just the garden, it's still a restoration of that ultimate intention that God has had from the beginning. So hopefully this is something that helps to bring into perspective a bit more deeply some of the things that, again, I feel like are often, not always, but often neglected. And so we're going to look at the next video on the cross and try to get into this a little bit further. What are the effects of the cross, of Jesus dying and raising again? Until next time, grace and peace to you in Christ.